everyone, welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the absolute monarchs of Russia. We'll start off with Ivan the Terrible and make our way to Peter the Great. So make sure you're in your interactive notebook and you're following along. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're on page 5 of your interactive notebook. And again, we're talking about the absolute monarchs of Russia. Let's get started with our essential question. What changes did Peter the Great make to Russia to make it more like Western Europe? As I said, we're going to start off with Ivan the Terrible and make our way to Peter the Great. But the majority of this lesson is going to focus on Peter the Great. So our first czar in Russia was Ivan the Terrible, as I said. In 1533, Ivan the Terrible became king of Russia, and he struggled for power with a group of people called the boyars. These were land-owning nobles. He does seize power from them, and he is crowned, or he crowns himself, the Tsar, which is a Russian term meaning Caesar, which we'll remember back to ancient Rome. So that term doesn't go away. By 1560, he turns against the boyars completely, kills a lot of them, seizes his lands, hence Ivan the Terrible. He's not very well liked. He was very paranoid. I think it's rumored that he actually killed his own son. He had a wife and she passes away, and kind of after she passes away, he kind of goes off the deep end. So a lot of people credit her death. He was kind of paranoid that maybe she was murdered. So he kind of goes off the deep end after her. Ivan's heir was very weak, and it does lead to a period of turmoil in Russia until we have the Romanov family come in 1613. So the other gentleman pictured here in the bottom right-hand corner is Michael Romanov. And as I said, he becomes Tsar in 1613. And him becoming Tsar begins a dynasty that rules Russia for almost 300 years. Remember, he is not ruling for 300 years. His family will be ruling for 300 years. So they set up this dynasty. And the Romanovs are successful in restoring order to Russia, which was key at this time period. So let's enter Peter the Great. He's from the Romanov family, and he comes into power in 1696. So he becomes Tsar in 1696, and he begins to reform Russia even more. He really admired the nations in Western Europe. So think France, England, Germany. These are all places that are west of Russia. Russia contrasted with Europe on a lot of different fronts. They were the land of boyars and serfs, so they're backwards. If you remember when we talked about in our Central European video and their monarchs, we said that they were a little bit backwards or outdated, still kind of doing some feudal manner type things, medieval type society. Russia was a little bit of the same. They are also cut off geographically with Europe. Russia is a vast chunk of land, in the Far East. It spans both Europe and Asia, so they are geographically cut off with some of these nations he really admired. They were also culturally isolated. Not much contact going on between them and Western Europe. There's huge religious differences, which also widen the gap. So by 1697, Peter actually goes and travels to Western Europe. He learns about technology, new ways of working, different types of fashion and presenting yourself and speaking, all of these different things. And it's really going to influence how he feels about his own country and what he wants to do for Russia while he's in rule. So one of Peter's biggest goals is that he wants to adopt a policy of Westernization. He wants to use Western Europe as a model for change in Russia. So he starts to put in place some of these different reforms. He brings the Orthodox Church under state control. So it's no longer church and state. It's all under Peter's control. He reduces the power of all those landowners. And he modernizes the army by having actually European army officials or officers train soldiers. So this kind of rubs some people the wrong way because, again, the Russians they're a very proud culture. They want to be set off on their own. Some of them are, but Peter thought this is what's going to be great for Russia. It's going to help modernize them, kind of bring them into the modern century during this time period and kind of get them out of their old antiquated ways. Peter, again, he wants to westernize Russia. So some of the things he does, and seems very minuscule, he introduces potatoes. Russians had never had a potato before. So, simple things like new foods are going to be revolutionizing in Russia. He started Russia's first newspaper. He raised the status of women. He also adopts Western fashion. The way in which they were dressing is much different. As you saw the picture of Michael Romanov with the long dress coat, he gets rid of that. They adopt more like a pants as opposed to that long house coat. Just very different ways that the Europeans were living from the Russians. He also advances education because he sees the importance in that. He also establishes a new city named St. Petersburg, named after himself, Petersburg. He really wanted to have a seaport that would make travel to the west easier and would also help with trading. So he does he does fight the country of Sweden, and ultimately they win out. The Russians win out and they win this port in the Baltic Sea, which he goes on to name St. Petersburg. So in 1703, he begins building his new capital and they name it, as I said, St. Petersburg. The building of the city actually took multiple years. A lot of serfs died in the process, so it wasn't something that was easily done. Some people felt that he poured a lot of time and money and blood, sweat, and tears, literally, into this, and for what? But it does become a huge city, and by the time of Peter's death, Russia was really a power to be reckoned with in Europe. So he does go through, he is an absolute monarch, but it wasn't all about Peter. It really was about Russia. So that is kind of something that's a little bit different from some of the other monarchs we have talked about that were kind of all about themselves. Whereas, although he named the city after himself, which is pretty me, but he really was trying to advance Russia, bring them up to date with some of these other countries so they could compete. And again, as we said, put themselves on top. So in our next lesson, we're going to talk about England and their absolute monarchs. As always, make sure this is in your interactive notebook, and we'll see you next time.